We're going to begin a time of teaching in just a minute, and we are going to be in a little letter at the end of the New Testament called 1 Thessalonians. It's not the easiest place in the scriptures to find because it's only like 2 or 3 pages long, and it has a funny name. But if you have brought a Bible, locate toward the end of your Bibles the little letter called 1 Thessalonians. If you need to use the table of contents to find it, that would seem perfectly natural to me. And if you didn't bring a Bible, there's some paperback ones on the ends of your row. You can have someone slide that down to you and locate 1 Thessalonians. We're going to be in chapter 2. Or you can Google the number 1, the name Thessalonians, Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 2. You could just Google that, and if you are looking at your phone, we will just assume that you're reading the Bible, that you got the Bible on your phone. That's just kind of how we play it here. So 1 Thessalonians 2 is where we're going to be today. Well, hey, I'm really excited to be with you today because we're going to talk today and for the next few weeks about the future of our church. And we're calling this series for the next 4 weeks Home. And we're calling it Home for 2 reasons. We are going to talk about some steps, some practical steps that we believe God is calling us to take in order to establish a full-time home as a base of ministry in the city. And if you've been tracking with us for very long, that itself is really exciting. But there's another reason we're calling this initiative Home, and it's because that we all know that a home is more than a building. It's the atmosphere that you create there. Like some of us grew up and lived in really nice houses, and yet we wouldn't say that our home was healthy. And some of us grew up in very mediocre houses. Like I grew up in very average, mediocre kind of houses. And yet I would say my home was full of life. And it's not full of life because of the house. It was full of life because of the people who lived there and the whole culture that they had together. So for the next few weeks, we are going to be talking about steps that we need to take in order to have a full-time building. And we'll talk about that. And we're going to talk about the kind of people that we're called to be in the atmosphere that we create together as a church. And you put those together and you've got home. Now, if you are new with us, this is going to be a little bit different than what we normally do on Sundays. In fact, someone told me after the first service that the unpacking of the scripture part of the sermon, which usually is like all we do in the sermon, was a little briefer than normal. So this is going to feel a little different than what we normally do for the next 4 weeks. But we're really glad that you're here because you're going to get a taste and you're going to get to hear and see what Fellowship Denver is all about for the next few weeks. You're going to see how much the people who call this place home love and care about our city. And so I hope that you'll just join us on this journey and you can participate or not participate however you feel compelled to do. But to get us all on the same page and up to speed as we go into this, we put together a short video just retelling the story of this church so far. You may or may not know this church started about 8 years ago with 4 people. And those 4 people gathered 25 people, and they formed a little group that started this church. And today there's about 700 to 800 people who are involved in the life of Fellowship Denver. And so to give you a sense of that story, 2 of us, myself and Dave Moreland, we were the 2 founding pastors of the church, and we're both still by God's grace here. We sat down in Dave's living room and we just retold the story of how we got to where we are today. His living room is where our first fellowship group met. At that time, like the whole church could be in one fellowship group. So we had like one church, one fellowship group, one living room. It was really kind of awkward, but that's who we were. And so we went back to his living room, sat down, and just retold the story of how we got to where we are today. And so we thought we'd share that with you to get us all on the same page this morning. So let's watch that. Fellowship Denver would not even exist if it hadn't been God's idea long before it was our idea. Too many things that we know aren't random have come together to create this church. In the summer of 2000, my job sent me here for a 3-month assignment, and this happened every year for the next 4 years. And during those summers, as I lived out here, I would see this thriving city center, and yet I wouldn't see the church. And yet not once in those 4 years did I think that I was going to be part of doing something about this.
Over the course of those 4 years, Hunter and I became good friends in seminary in Dallas. And one evening, Renee and I had Hunter over for dinner. As we were talking, Renee just made this comment. She said, hey guys, maybe you should actually start something together, maybe do a church plant. And we kind of laughed about it and said, probably not. Yeah, Hunter said, actually, if we ever did do that, I know where, we should look into Denver.
And then I had this spooky Holy Spirit kind of experience where it was like, it said, you don't need to pray anymore about this. This is what you're supposed to do. And we realized at that point God was already doing this well before we had thought about it.
We worked and went through training for a couple of years, and we moved to Denver for this church plant, and we began to pray. We also began to host these open forums in coffee shops. We'd have people come who were curious about Christianity, had questions about the Bible, and we would answer questions that they had. We'd host these seminars and forums, and people would actually come to it, shockingly. And that collected a core group of people who wanted to start Fellowship Denver. And in September of 2006, we started our first worship service.
As we started and met people, we told them that we were about just two things. We wanted to make Jesus and his gospel the center of our church. That's what we wanted everyone to encounter in our midst. And secondly, we wanted to work hard to love and understand the people in Denver. And we believe when we do those two things, when we love God's word and love the gospel, and we love people and understand them, there's power. And that's what Fellowship Denver is about.
So for the past several years, we've seen Fellowship Denver grow from a small group of people meeting in a little art gallery to now a large group of people who are growing as disciples, whose passion is growing for the city and whose love of Jesus is growing as well.
So God has been thinking and working way ahead of us all along, and we sense that we're at another one of those points where he has something planned for us. Over the last few years, we've become convinced that if Fellowship Denver had a full-time home, we would be more visible, more accessible, able to include more of Denver in our life. Right now, our facility situation is an obstacle to that happening, and we don't want to settle for that. We think it could actually be a help to our mission. So here's what we're asking all of us to do. Would you join us in a season of intentional prayer and preparation? Prayer. Let's ask God to give us a home and to show us what he has planned for us. We don't know how he is going to answer, but we do sense that he wants to answer. So wouldn't it be fun to pray and to watch together for how he's going to lead us? And then there's preparation. When he answers, we need to be ready. And so we're raising an opportunity fund so that we can take the first steps toward acquiring a building when he shows us the way.
All right, so you heard it there. This fall, we are going to pray that God would give us a home. And the fun thing about this is we don't know exactly where that's going to be or what precisely that's going to look like. And I'll tell you in a minute a little bit more about some of our experience that's led us to this point. But we don't know what that's going to look like or where that's going to be precisely. We have some general parameters that we are praying about. But that's exciting to me because we are going to together get to experience what it looks like to ask God for something and to keep our eyes open for how he's going to answer. And we're going to get to experience together how he's going to answer, and I believe he will. So we're going to pray that he's going to give us a home, and we're going to prepare by raising the fund that will allow us to take the steps that we need to take, especially the first steps when he answers. And we're going to ask everyone who calls Fellowship Denver home to pray with us and to consider what what you can give above and beyond just your regular normal giving to help us over the next year prepare for this. And I'll be telling you more about what that looks like, and I'll tell you how you can get questions answered, because that raises all kinds of questions and stuff. I'll tell you more about that as we go. But here's what I want us to remember as we start this, and this is where we're going to spend some time today. A home is more than a building. It's an atmosphere created by the people who live there. It's what people experience when they're with you. As we go through this, I'll tell you stories of people who have created atmospheres and what people have experienced as a result of that. So it's what people experience when they're with you. And it's easy for us to miss that when we start talking about finding a building, because when you've been a mobile church for 8 years, here's where our minds tend to go when we start thinking about finding a building, and my mind just goes there with you. I think it'll be so nice when we don't have to set up a sound system and 500 folding chairs every week. It'll be so nice when my butt will fit in the chairs, and the chairs will cradle me with soft padding. Did you know there's a whole industry of people who make chairs for churches? And they're all wide, and they're really soft. Wide, soft chairs. Why do you think that is? Because a lot of church people are wide and softer people. And so they just make chairs that fit. Do you know where these chairs are primarily sold to? Funerals. That's primarily what these black folding chairs are used for, right? Because you don't need to have a comfortable experience when you go to a funeral. You need to be reminded of suffering. And so I have a friend. In fact, I have a friend who visited once, and then he refuses to come back because our chairs are too small and uncomfortable, and he says we're only a church for small, skinny people. Which I'm like, hey, that's what I set out to do. We think it'll be so nice when we can make the acoustics better. You guys may or may not realize we have an excellent sound team. In fact, we have a guy who runs our sound team who's done it for great churches, and yet this is the most acoustically challenging room in all of Denver. We found it, and we decided to do church here, right? And so if you're ever like, God, it's a little awkward in here, that's because it's a little awkward in here. And so we think, man, it'll be nice, so we don't have to deal with that anymore. It'll be great when the bathroom has consistently working paper towel dispensers. Today is a good day. Today is a working paper towel day. Next week may not be a working paper towel week. Now, I feel all of those tensions, and especially if you're involved in setting up and putting together these Sunday gatherings, man, I would love nothing more than to repurpose you and to let you do something else on Sunday mornings besides set up chairs. And I would love to give our teachers and our children awesome classrooms. And I like washing my hands and drying them off after going to the bathroom. You know, I don't like having to do this before I shake hands with people. So I feel all of that. And yet, here's the thing. I don't wake up every day going, man, I can't wait till we don't have to set up church every week. Like, that actually doesn't get me excited for more than a couple of minutes. And we're not starting this season of prayer and preparation because we think it sure would be nicer if we had a building. And we're not going to ask you to give sacrificially just so we can upgrade some acoustics and sleep a little bit later on Sunday mornings. The reason I get really excited about this is because the kind of church that Fellowship Denver is, and the hope that God has given us for this city, and the opportunity a building would create to share that with more of Denver, and the obstacles it would remove, the many obstacles it would remove from sharing that with more of Denver. Like, we're not even hitting our potential right now, because we'll talk about this. So I don't get excited about a home with padded chairs and warmer acoustics in it. I get excited about a home with Fellowship Denver in it. I get excited about a home with you guys in it. So for the next few weeks, as we talk about praying and preparing for God to lead us to a home, I just want to help you engage who we are and what we're all about as a church. I want to help you be the kind of people who create the kind of atmosphere where people meet God, so that when God answers our prayer for a home, and He will, I believe He will, a certain kind of people are going to move in there. And we won't just have a building, we'll have a home that you'll be proud of. So if you've been around here for long, you've heard us say this before, and it's just worth repeating every time we gather. This is kind of what we dream about as a church, and we say it like this. We long to see a gospel movement that fills Denver with disciples of Jesus. Now, this city we love, Denver is a real important word there, because this city we love, 1% of the people in the urban core, like within 3 or 4 miles of where we're all sitting right now, 1% of the people identify as Christian, and then 14% in the metro area at large, which either way you slice it is way below the average in America. So we're one of the more unreached sections of America, if you will. So whether you live in Aurora or whether you live in downtown Denver, you live in a place where very, very few people claim to follow Jesus. And here's the issue, we think, as we talk to people. Most of them haven't actually encountered Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have some notion of who he is or some opinion about what Christianity is or some notion of what Christianity is, but their impression is not the real Jesus or the real Christianity. In fact, not too long ago, I talked to someone who was discovered I was a pastor and then proceeded to tell me why he loved Jesus but didn't need to belong to a church. And he basically goes, man, because I already get what Jesus is about. And I said, oh, really? What's he about? He goes, man, he's all about being nice to people and not doing mean crap. Except he didn't say crap. He used another word. Be nice to people and don't do mean crap. So I got that. And I said, that's actually probably one implication of what we would call the gospel of Jesus. But that's like not the whole message. There's like a lot more substance and beauty to what Jesus said than be nice and don't do mean crap. And so a lot of people in our city don't actually know what Jesus was about. They don't even know his message. They think it was some version of be nice and love people. And that's it. Now, others have had such an experience with Christianity that they think Christianity is mainly a system of moral reform. It is a system by where bad people try to get good. So if you don't think you're that bad off, well, why do you need this? Or if you've been driven to despair by people who told you to be better, and that's become frustrating, why do you need this? That's actually not Christianity. So most people in our city don't know what it is. So our hope is to fill the city with disciples of Jesus, because not only do most people not even know what Jesus was about or what his core message was about, they don't even know a credible representative of Jesus or Christianity. And so we want anyone in our city to have access to a credible witness to Jesus. Now, we think the key to doing that is what we call the gospel, which is just shorthand in the New Testament for who Jesus is and what he did and what it means for us. And we think this gospel is so compelling that there is power and there is life in it, because there's power and there's life in what Jesus did and who he is. So our hope is that anyone in our city would know who Jesus is because they know someone who's been impacted by his gospel. We hope that anyone in our city would have a fresh encounter with who Jesus is, and they would go, oh, I thought Jesus was all about being nice and not doing mean crap, but actually he talked about a new kingdom that God is creating in this world and how we need to be saved into it. And then he went to a cross and died for us and rose from the dead, conquering death, so that we can be saved into this kingdom. And he does it all as this marvelous gift of grace. I don't have to morally reform myself in order to get in on that. Now, no one in our city knows that. So our hope is that anyone in our city would have access to that message because they know someone who's been changed and impacted that. That's what we mean when we say, see a gospel movement that fills Denver with disciples of Jesus. Now that sounds kind of big and pie in the sky-ish, but there's something interesting when you begin to study the life of the early church. The church that was really the Jesus movement, and it started small, and then it just grew and grew and grew and grew after Jesus' resurrection. Here's the interesting thing about them. They weren't sitting around with whiteboards and flow charts asking, how do we create a movement? They weren't sitting around going, how do we grow this thing really big so it takes over the whole Greco-Roman world? And yet they grew really big and took over the Greco-Roman world. There was no grand scheme that they orchestrated. Instead, they were just doing some really simple, small things over and over and over again. Not small in significance, but small in simplicity. It was so simple that everyone who joined them, who came into their home and encountered the life they had together, wanted to get in on it, and then they just started doing the same things. That's all it was. It was just simple things that all of us could do too, that they just did over and over and over again. That's all a movement is. It's just simple things done over and over again. So for the next few weeks, as we're talking about this, we're going to ask, what are the simple things that we could all do? And if we all did them over and over again, then this hope of seeing a gospel movement that fills Denver with disciples of Jesus suddenly goes from being big, audacious, mission impossible to something very, very doable. Now, what do you call simple things that are done over and over again? Habits? So a few months ago, I started asking our staff and our elders and some of our leaders, what do we do as a church that makes us us? What are the habits that we have cultivated and we need to teach everyone to live out in order to be the kind of church where the gospel is at work and where disciples are made and where people actually encounter the real Jesus? What kind of habits do we need to cultivate? And we came up with 5 things. Now, there's more probably habits. We could just teach habits, from now till Jesus comes back. But we decided that these 5 themes stood out over and over and over again. And these habits really make us us. And so for the next few weeks, I'm just going to teach them to you. And here's the thing I'm really excited about. This makes our mission simple and doable. Like, I want it to be so simple that if you're married, you can sit down with your spouse and say, sweetie, honey, boo, baby, whatever you guys call each other. Do we practice these habits in our life together? Do our friends experience this with us? How would we lead our family into doing these things? Or if you're not married, you can get together with some friends and say, we could do these things together. In fact, can you imagine the impact we would have as just a group of friends if we did these 5 habits together? Or if you lead a fellowship group, that's about 100 of you. About 100 people are involved on a leadership team of a fellowship group in our church. So if you lead a fellowship group, you could sit down with your leadership team and ask, how do we practice these things in our life together as a group? This is the mission of Fellowship Denver, just made simple and doable, practical form that you can do in your marriage, with your friends, in your group. And here's the idea. If in this season of praying and seeking and asking what God's going to do and where he's going to lead us and preparing by giving, we're also asking God to make us into a certain kind of people. So we're asking him for a home and we're giving sacrificially and we're living out who we are and our mission in everyday life. Then when God answers our prayers, we'll be ready. We'll be ready financially, and we'll be ready as a people, so that when we move into a full-time facility, we won't just have a building. We'll have a home that you would want to invite anyone in our city into. You got the picture? All right. Today, we're going to learn habit number 1, and then we'll come back and talk more about what else we're going to do to prepare. But to see this first habit, we're going to read this letter that I had you, part of this letter that I had you turn to. It's written by Paul the Apostle to a church he started in a city called Thessalonica, therefore Thessalonians, First Thessalonians. And more than any other human agent, Paul was responsible for the rapid growth and the expansion of the Jesus movement. He started as a chief opponent of Christianity when it was spreading in Jerusalem. So if you think the teaching of Jesus is crazy, Paul has walked in your shoes. He, at one point in his life, thought Christians were crazy. And then he had an encounter with the real Jesus. Just what we want everyone to have. So he had notions and premonitions that were wrong. And then he had an encounter with the real Jesus, and he became convinced that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and everything for him changed. In fact, he started traveling throughout the Greco-Roman world telling people about Jesus because he was so compelled by this message. And then he would organize his followers into churches. He would establish some leadership in the churches, typically called elders or pastors or overseers. And then he would just move on and do it again in another city. And Paul spent a lot of time traveling. He would spend sometimes years in a city. Sometimes he would just spend a few weeks. And a big chunk of your New Testament are letters that he wrote to churches that he established. And in many of his letters, you get a strong sense of what Paul taught, like the content of the gospel that he preached. And In fact, a couple of years ago in the life of this church, we went through the letter to the Romans because in that letter, Paul more exhaustively than anywhere else lays out the content of the message of the gospel. So we went through that letter together. But 1 Thessalonians is interesting in another way because in this little letter, Paul doesn't just give examples of what he taught. In fact, he gives no exhaustive treatment of what he taught, although he refers to it and gives snippets. In this letter, he reminds the Thessalonians and us how he lived and what he did. Now, think about this. The most effective missionary in the history of Jesus goes into a city where nobody knows about Jesus. They couldn't even say 1%. And he starts a church that becomes a movement in that city. Might we have something to learn from this guy? And here's the fascinating thing we'll discover. What he did, anybody who follows Jesus can do. Sometimes when we're talking about Paul, we're tempted to think Paul was super sold out, maybe slightly weird Christian who traveled everywhere telling people about Jesus. I'm not quite that crazy. I'm not a traveling missionary. I can't really do what Paul did. And yet, in this letter, he describes something that's so simple that you can do it. This is what he did, and he's going to show us. And we think that doing this is an essential part of what we do in Fellowship Denver. Now, it's not the only thing we do, but we think it's an essential part. In fact, it's the starting point for what we do. So here's how this is going to work. We're going to read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, primarily verses 1 to 8. And when we get to verse 7 and 8, we're going to camp out there for a little while. And that's really going to describe the habit that we're going to look at today. So we'll read this passage. We'll slow down when we get to verse 7 and 8. And then we'll summarize this habit in our own words. It'll be simple. It'll be memorable. You can do it. And then we'll come back and talk more about creating a home. Now, to understand what we're going to read, you need to know a little bit of what's happening when Paul wrote this letter. Paul had arrived in Thessalonica almost by accident. He would not say by accident. He would say God sovereignly arranged the circumstances that led him there. But before this, he had been in a city called Philippi. In fact, he wrote another letter to the church that he established in Philippi just a few pages earlier in your New Testament called Philippians. And in Philippi, Paul had spent some time and he had been wrongfully thrown in jail after some local Jewish religious leaders got upset with his teaching. And so the authorities in Philippi eventually figured out this was all a big mistake. Paul should not have been in prison. They apologized to him, and then they asked him to leave the city so that there would be no more unrest. Like they weren't really concerned that the message of Jesus get out clearly. They were just more concerned that there be no more riots. And so they said, hey, we're going to release you. You did nothing wrong. We acknowledge that. We're so sorry. Would you leave? And so he had to kind of leave quickly. Him and his traveling companions, he always traveled with others, they moved on, and the next city they come to is Thessalonica. And best we can tell, Paul stayed in Thessalonica a few weeks. We get a story of how he was in Philippi and then moved on to Thessalonica, what he did there. That's in Acts chapter 16 and 17, earlier in the New Testament. So if you want to read about the background, you can read those two chapters and you'll kind of be up to speed on this. Best we can tell, he stayed there for a few weeks, and quite a few people, Jews and Gentiles, started to follow Jesus. And this so upset the Jewish leaders in that city that they also incited a riot. They heard inciting a riot is a good way to get Paul to move on. So they incited a riot, which meant, again, Paul had to leave hastily to spare his life. So all of this is Acts chapter 16 and 17. And then after driving Paul out of the city, they tried to discredit his ministry. So when he gets settled in a new city, he writes a letter to the church in Thessalonica that he had established. He writes a letter to them defending his message and his ministry. And in the section we're going to read today, he's defending his credibility. And here's where it gets really interesting for us. He doesn't just remind them of the truthfulness of the gospel that he preached. First, he reminds them of how he lived among them and what he did. It's something that any of us can do, and it's essential to seeing a gospel movement. So we're going to read it. We're going to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll slow down when we get to verse 7 and 8. So if you have your Bibles open or on your phone, read along with me. Paul writes, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you is not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamelessly treated at Philippi, as you know, we have boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So he's basically going, here's one reason you can know that we have credibility as messengers, because this was not comfortable for us to bring this message to you. We had to endure a lot of conflict just in order to be there with you and to get this message to you. So it wasn't like we were doing this in a way that was really life-giving and comfortable for us. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know. And he's saying, here's another reason that you can know that we're legit, that this message is genuine, that we have credibility. Because we didn't just come flattering you, meaning we didn't just come telling you what we thought you wanted to hear. We shared with you everything about who Jesus is and what he did, even the parts that we thought would be a little bit confusing to you, even the parts that we thought you would naturally, instinctively go, oh, awesome. As soon as we said that, we told you the whole thing. So we weren't just flattering you. So if you ever have preaching where you're like, man, I agree. Oh, I already believed that. Yep, that's affirming everything I already believed and thought. Probably not the gospel of Jesus, because there's aspects of it that are counterintuitive to us, and later we can theologically explain why that is, but it turns out we're not perfectly synced up with God, so he often says things that aren't immediately instinctively right and true and good to us. Nonetheless, they bring life when they sit with us. So Paul goes, we didn't flatter you guys, as you know, nor did we come with a pretext for greed, God is witness. Nor do we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. So we weren't asking you to give us a bunch of stuff. We weren't asking you to pay us off. But we were gentle among you. This is where we're going to spend some time today. We were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. Affectionately desirous means to long for someone and to want something for them. Not just to long from them in like a, maybe I want to be with you kind of way, but to long for them in a, I want something for you kind of way. And then he says, you have become very dear to us. Very dear is actually one word in the Greek, which is just the language in which Paul wrote this letter. It's one word in Greek, and it's a form of the word agape, which is where we often get our word for love. In fact, it literally would be translated beloved, the ones who are agaped. So, beloved. Now, agape is the word that's most often used to describe God's own love for us. It's the word that Jesus used when he said one of the most famous things he's ever said, John 3:16. Have you ever seen the signs at the football games or on Tebow's eye black? John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Agape, this kind of love, combines affection and action. It combines, I want something for you, I have affection for you, and then it combines action with that. So, God longs for you with a gut kind of longing, so he gives his son. Paul longs for these Thessalonians. They have become very dear to him, so he gives. Being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves. So Paul was not just a preacher who rolled into town and gathered a crowd and preached the gospel and passed the plate. He shared himself because he loved them. So this habit we're going to learn today is going to have something to do with loving people in the same way that we have been ourselves loved by God and are today loved by him. Now, here's something we have to acknowledge when we talk about loving people. It's the key, in fact, to actually loving them as opposed to just having strong feelings about them that don't translate into agape. It's embedded in the picture Paul painted in verse 7. In fact, it's all throughout this paragraph. But he goes in verse 7, he goes, we were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So if you want to see how I love you, look at a nursing mother taking care of her children. Now, here's the thing about being a nursing mother. It's about the most inconvenient thing in the world. Like the people I had dinner with last night were 45 minutes late because baby had to eat and it didn't happen at a convenient time. So they inconvenienced themselves and me so that they could nurse the baby. To be a nursing mother is hard work. In fact, continue reading in verse 9. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So being a nursing mother is hard work, and so is being a father. To be a good father, you can't just come home after a long day and crack open a PBR and turn on the game. You have to engage with your children. That can be tiring. That can be work. One of the best things a father can do is to be proactive with his children, to think at every stage of their little lives, what does my son, what does my daughter need from me right now? What are they going to need from me in the coming months and the year? How do I help them grow? A father has to understand his children and then develop them according to knowledge and according to understanding. This doesn't happen accidentally. It's hard work. So to exhort and to encourage these people and to charge them to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel of God, Paul had to understand them. He had to know who they were. He had to know what they were like. He had to know where their fears were. He had to know where their temptations lied. He had to know where their desires were. He had to know what their lives were like. So we were like a nursing mother. We were like a father with his children. You became very, very dear to us. So we were ready to share with you not just the gospel, but ourselves. That's the habit that made him so effective. Now, we're going to summarize it. And this little summary is not easy to do, but it's simple. And by simple, we mean not made of a lot of parts. It's so simple, anyone who has the Spirit of God living in them can do this. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, or as the Arkansas football coach once said, a scientific rocket. You don't have to be a scientific rocket to figure out how to do this. Anybody with the Spirit of God living in them can do this. You don't even have to be as smart as a football coach. Most of them are not smart. And you watch football games, you're like, those guys, what are they doing? They're not that bright. So you don't have to be even as smart as a football coach to do this. It's simple. And when you do it, you're living out the mission of Fellowship Denver. Here's how we're going to summarize it. Work hard to love and understand people. Work hard to love and understand people. I hope you can get together with your friends in your fellowship group or your spouse, maybe even alone in prayer, and ask, is there someone God has put in our lives so we can love them? Do we understand them? When people are with us and when they come into our community or into our home, do they sense that we love them? Do they sense that we're interested in them? Do they sense that we've done any work to understand them? This church was started with this intention. We will work hard and we will stretch ourselves and we will strive to understand Denver and to love her people. So we won't just show up with a message and assume we know everything about these people. We will work hard to love them and to understand them so it can be translated into terms that they'll understand. It can be applied to their lives in ways that fit who they actually are. We'll not be just content to know and understand people who are already just like us, but we'll put in the work to love and understand our city and our friends. That never stops. Now, I believe we do that. I believe that's part of what makes this church special and unique. So this decision to seek a full-time home for Fellowship Denver came out of our experience loving and understanding people. And here's what we've learned. Here's what we've heard. I'll just give you a couple of examples. We've heard this several times, many times. I'm so glad I found this church. I didn't even realize you guys were here. Why are they glad to have found this church? Because of what they experience in our midst. Why do they not realize we're here? Because we're not all that findable or visible. So I get excited about a home with Fellowship Denver in it because we could share this with more people. In fact, next week we'll show you the story. We've got it on video. It'll blow you away, of a guy who came into our home and just experienced that he was loved and that he was understood. It was okay to be honest about where he was. And in the process of that, he discovered who Jesus was. So we want to be findable. We want to be accessible to tons more people. I want to just take who you guys already are and give that to more people. Now here's something else we've learned. Families with children, we meet a lot of families with children. We have families in our midst who have raised their kids in the life of our church. We're going to get to dedicate some babies next week and do more of that, right? And we'll tell you a story in a couple of weeks of a family who's lived life and raised their kids in the life of this church. And there are a lot more like them in our city. And they're often at stages of life where they're open and willing to be part of a church and to consider with fresh eyes who Jesus is. And they often come into our midst and they like what they experience here. They find you guys interesting and attractive, but here's an obstacle we run into over and over again. Our facility, like one floor below us, it doesn't communicate that we're really here for kids. It just doesn't say that when you walk in. They do incredible work down there. It doesn't just scream, "Welcome, children." It more screams like spooky ride at, Disney World or something like that. So there's just a couple of ways we've learned this building, even though like someone painted all this stuff and it's got some cool things about it, it's an obstacle to sharing our life with more of Denver. And we're asking, what if it became an asset instead? Can you imagine how cool it would be if it was an asset to our mission? So for the past 2 years, we have been looking for a full-time home, and we've learned some things as we've looked. And these things have led us to the point we're at today. And so we've looked quite a bit, and here's what we've learned. First of all, we've learned that there's got to be something out there that God has prepared for us. We feel confident of that because we've seen other things that would work for us. So we know, we're not looking for a unicorn. It exists. This species of building thing exists. Now, there's not one in every corner, but they're out there. So we know we're not looking for something that doesn't exist. We've seen different buildings, different opportunities. Sometimes it would be an existing building that we would retrofit. Sometimes it's an old dying church building. Sometimes it's a piece of land where we can think, when I say piece of land, think of something like an acre that we could build something on. And so we've seen things, but here's what else we've learned. The real estate market here moves really quickly. We're not in Detroit. We're not in an ignored city center with empty buildings sitting around. We're in a developed and dense area where things move quickly, so we have to be ready to act when an opportunity comes. And to this point, we haven't been as ready to act as we need to be to act. And that means having some cash on hand that will make us a credible buyer, and we can quickly access it to move, to lock something down when God gives us an opportunity. So our goal this fall is to raise an opportunity fund of $500,000. And we're going to raise that in 2 ways. We're going to ask, what can we give? What can you give today? And over the next year, above and beyond your normal giving, to help us build that fund. So if we were to give today and over the course of the next year, what can you do? And we're going to ask everyone who calls Fellowship Denver home to prayerfully think about and consider what you can give one time over the course of next year in order to build that fund. And I'm telling you that today, not to put any pressure on you to make a quick decision, but so you can discuss it, pray about it, decide. Maybe there's some things you can adjust, sacrifice, change for the next year to make this possible. And then on Sunday, November 16th, a few weeks from now, we're just going to ask you to bring two things, to bring a one-time gift and to bring a commitment for what you can give over the course of the next year so we can begin to be ready. And then we are just going to pray together. And it could be a couple of months, it could be a year, who knows, but we're going to pray together and just see what God does. And when he answers, we will be ready to respond. Now, if you want more info about this, and I know this raises all kinds of practical questions, and what about this, what about this? We're prepared to have those conversations. And so here's what we've created to help you get more info. We have some printed info, which is a fold-out pamphlet that we put together, and it just describes the why we're doing this and the what we've experienced so far and what this could look like. And how we arrived at the number and amount of money we need to raise. And so we put together this, and we would invite you to grab one of those. If you've given over the last year, you've probably received one of these in the mail, but if you haven't, grab one of these. Inside there is also an FAQ sheet. So as we've talked to people, we've just collected the most common questions we get and tried to answer those as much as we know, as much info as we have today. And then a second thing we're going to do is on November 3rd, which is a Monday night, we're going to host a dessert in someone's home. It's a nice big house, and so we can get lots of people in there. And we'll just share all the details of how we got to this point and let you ask any questions you want. So if you're like a detail person and you want to really dive into all of that, this dessert is for you. And there is some info about that in your weekly, a little card there with directions on it. And you can just come and show up on Monday night, November 3rd. And then we will also have just information and people available next 4 weeks here in our time together. There's a table in the back that says home after the service and all the services for the next few weeks. I'll be back there. Some of our other elders will be back there. And if you just have a quick question or an idea you want to bounce off of us, we would love to hear that or talk to you, and we'll be back there when the service is over. And here again is why we're excited about this. Because it's a home, it will be a home with Fellowship Denver in it. It'll be a home in it where the people who live there work hard to love and understand people. And so during this season of praying and preparing by giving, I want us also to keep working hard to love and understand the people God has put into our lives so that when he answers our prayers, and I think he will, we won't just have a building, we'll have a home, and it won't just be a home for us. It'll be a home that we are proud to invite our friends into. Can we pray together? All right, let's pray. Father, you have been very good to us and very kind to us. You've been so good to all of us just as people. You have loved us. You have loved us even when we were far from you. You have loved us when we were just arrogant people who thought we had it all together and didn't need you. And you sent your son for us, and he died for us. And so you have given and continue to give for us. And then you've loved us as a church. You've created us out of nothing. You sustained us. As I look back at that video and think about those early years, I think about how freaking scared I was. I think of how afraid I was. And yet, you just consistently have showed up. And you've showed up because, not because we're awesome, but because there's power and there's goodness in your gospel. There's a power and there's goodness in the whole gospel, in all of it. And you have blessed your word. And so we thank you for being so good to us. And we ask that you would now take us on a journey. I pray that not too long from now, we would just have something incredible to celebrate together, another chapter in this story. And we will just be able to share what you have done and the people that you've created with more of our city. And we ask that not because we get any kicks out of being big or we get any kicks out of growing, but because there's people who are dear to us, and we want to share your life with them. And so we ask this in Jesus' name, who made this possible for us, and by his Spirit, who makes this doable for us. Amen.